Okay, I'd like to bring this meeting to order. The Village of Villa Park Board of Trustees Committee, the whole meeting, September 11th, 2023. Clerk Kornacki, please call the roll.
Trustee Alfano. Trustee Cordova.
Here.
Trustee Corkery. Trustee Kozar. Trustee Kumar. Trustee Patrick. President Kazan.
Here. And please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, our discussion item this evening is CDM Smith's study on the grade separation at rail crossings. The Board of Trustees will be asked to provide input on the data collected by CDM Smith. CDM Smith has evaluated the possible railroad crossing grade separation projects based on traffic and other objective data and collected a substantial amount of public input as well. The presentation and discussion will help direct the completion of the study and potential next steps. And I'll turn this over to our Director of Public Works, Mike Guerra.
Thank you. Yeah. If the board remembers, back in December of actually 2022, we passed a resolution on a contract to enter into a grade separation study with CDM Smith. And that study was to look at all the locations along our UP corridor to see what it will take to actually construct a motorized and pedestrian overpass or underpass at several locations. We presented, I think, to the board in April of this year, kind of the kickoff, and we're bringing it back. We're bringing it back maybe like a half a step early to present our findings. And the reason we're doing that is because, as you can see with the findings, it's not super clear. So we'd like some input on the board based on their feelings and recommendations so that we can incorporate that into the final study so that we have a very usable document moving forward and have a cohesive plan for our grade separation. And with that, we do tonight have Ms. Jessie Carroll with us, who was our project manager and coordinated most of this work, and she can present it. And then assisting her is Steve Przinski, who is with also CDM Smith and is on this project.
Thank you very much for having us present here today. I want to also commend the board on the decision, and Mike and your staff, on the decision to really develop this feasibility study to understand really what it would take to develop a full grade separation within the Village of Villa Park. So I think it's very forward-looking and really good to just get that data collected and understand really what it takes for the next steps. So with that, today we have a lot of information to cover, so I'm probably going to talk a little bit quickly. If you need me to slow down at any point, please let me know. But we have our agenda today. We're going to just go back over the study overview, which actually Mike covered pretty well just now. Also talk over our schedule, where we are currently in the process. We've got the existing conditions analysis, just to touch on a few of the data points that we did collect. There was a public survey put out, so we'll go through some of the results of that. We'll start working on the concept development phase for grade separations at particular locations. We'll look at the assessments of impacts and the benefits of those alternatives at the locations, and then we'll open it up for some discussion and some feedback as well. So with that, we kind of talked about the study overview already, so thank you, Mike. And then we'll jump right into the schedule. So again, back in April, we did bring to the Committee of the Whole to just present the feasibility study, started kind of a kickoff meeting. We also opened up the public survey at that time. We then met with Village Park representatives, stakeholders, internal to Villa Park, and staff, and talked over some of the results, not only of the study, but a little bit of the impacts of some of the alternatives. So we had a little bit of internal discussion before we really got moving on the concept development. We've been refining the concepts over the summer, and now here we are to talk with you, get some final input, and then incorporate that into our final recommendations. So existing conditions. As part of the feasibility study, we really are looking to understand feasible in a way, recognizing best utility, recognizing major needs, some of the issues, environmental issues, and so we'll walk through some of those high-level overview. One of the first things we did was we looked at the local traffic profile. There were 4 alternatives or 4 grade crossing locations we looked at, Westmore being one, although it's not currently a grade crossing at this time. It was an opportunity just for us to look to see if that had any more benefit than the other locations, also shown here, Addison, Ardmore, and Villa Avenue. So with Westmore, obviously not a local crossing, two-lane cross-section on north and south of the tracks. At Addison, this was a minor arterial. Addison actually had the highest average daily traffic, ADT numbers there. It's a 4-lane section, so that does make sense. Also, we'll get into some delay by trains, which brings Addison back in. But Ardmore also a little bit lower traffic than Addison. A 2-lane section, again, makes sense on that. And then we looked at Villa Avenue as well, all part of our scope here. And then Villa had the lowest average daily traffic of any of the crossings we evaluated. So as we kind of understood where the traffic sat, we started looking, no pun intended, but we started to look at the train crossings and the average hours of delay at each of these locations. So this is average delay per weekday. Back in 2018, we started looking at this information. There's over 100 trains per day in 2018, 59 Metro trains in 2018, but it's still right about the same right now that you're experiencing in 2023. With that, we're looking at almost 160 hours of delay for motorists, not per motorist, but overall total hours of delay. For Ardmore, it's 130 hours a day, and Villa, again, with the lowest traffic volumes, has the lowest hours of delay. But again, pretty substantial delay, which I'm sure you have all experienced at some point in driving through the village. So this, again, just starts to build the case for providing funding, providing the case to really do a grade separation here in Villa Park. We also looked at the crash data. We looked at the last 5 years of data that were available, that being 2017 to 2021. I know there was COVID in there, so some of the traffic impact may have been reflected there, but you can see from the legend here, I know it's a little bit small to read, the red dots represent rear end crashes, and you can kind of see clusters of them at the tracks. And some of that type of crash is related, well, some of it's distracted driving, but some of it also, there's a lot of access points, especially at Ardmore. You can see those clusters. Ardmore, you've got a lot of driveways there, so people maybe a little bit maybe speeding, something like that. One of the reasons we look at the crash data is to understand if we put an improvement in, would it benefit, would it improve the safety at these crossings as well, just in the traffic crash data. And from what I see here, there were 170 total crashes, approximately 170, in the project area over those 5 years. There were no fatalities reported. But there is an opportunity for grade separations. If there weren't some of those driveway access points, if we're rethinking that, it may reduce that certain type of crash, that rear end crash. It may also prevent some of the angle crashes, depending how that's separated. So again, possibility to improve crash history at any one of these locations. We also took a look at the environmental overview. We recognize that there's really no critical habitat for any threatened or endangered species within Villa Park. That. We did not see any historic or architectural resource that we need to be concerned with, and there was a low risk of flooding in the crossing locations. What we did see, some potential environmental issues that may come up if there were to be an improvement. At Addison, there's the public space, the Iowa Community Center is there. That property is considered open parkland, so that could, if we were to do any impact or any improvements there and maybe need to take some of that property, we just have to work with some mitigation strategy to accommodate that improvement. At Terrace Park, also, again, that 4F over at Westmore, if that was going to be an option, we'd have to look into some sort of mitigation if there was going to be a real impact to that property. And then we did recognize that there is a lust site or a leaking underground storage tank around the Ardmore crossing. Again, something to be mitigated, just something to be aware of as you move into a next phase. But no red flags. There was nothing obvious that was saying this is not a feasible alternative at any of these crossing locations, so that's good. So we talked a little bit about public engagement. We met here before in April. We worked with village stakeholders internal in May, and now we're back again just to kind of present the rest of the findings. But from that online survey we discussed here, we got 150 responses. So that's really pretty good in my mind for some of the public engagement I've seen with these studies. Ooh, I keep hitting buttons. And from that, we did ask a series of questions, and what we really came up with was that, the top of mind is response times. Emergency response times is a major issue involved with not having a grade separation in Villa Park. Reliable travel times, safety, and again, delay. Both pedestrian and motorized travel was obviously, it was something we would have thought we would have seen, but it showed in the results. And then a common theme, really, just again, improved access, both for community destinations as well as just north and south travel. And then really we did hear pretty resoundingly was that pedestrian crossings are really key for many people, particularly riding metro trains. There were some issues, it sounds like, with trains loading or unloading on opposite sides of what they're anticipating. Once the train comes, there's no option to be able to cross over. And so even people were saying that they'd been considering, or they typically go drive over to Elmhurst or another metro station to have that reliability, and recognizing that they have an opportunity to cross tracks should that switch. So just something to keep in mind as far as the alternatives. Pedestrian only, I'll just hint, don't want to give away all the secrets. So based on what we heard with the public outreach and recognizing that really this is a grade separation, so really the options here are overpass or underpass, we started to develop the alternatives to recognize what kind of impact each of those types of crossings would have at the locations that we've mentioned before. So once we started looking more at the alternatives, I'm showing you this map just to show again, Westmore was under consideration. After the meeting that we had with the village staff at the internal stakeholder meeting, it really was decided that Westmore not being an existing crossing, at grade crossing now, really didn't make too much sense to carry it forward. So it was kind of dismissed from consideration moving into an overpass or underpass alternative. So then we're left with the three major crossings at Addison, Ardmore, and Villa. I'll note, because we did do motorized and unmotorized, and I'll get into this, but because of that, not necessarily separating a grade or pedestrian-only grade separation at Ardmore, but recognizing that the metro station made more sense to provide that pedestrian-only underpass. So I'll put that out there, but again, the three crossings where we're looking. So we'll start talking about the motorized alternatives and some of the considerations. You know, obviously I mentioned the overpass and underpass are really our options for the locations. Just keeping in mind here, underpasses typically tend to be more expensive, particularly under railroad crossings, mostly because that structure for the railroad bridge is so significant that it's just more costly to make that type of improvement. And there's some pictures on the right side that you can see there. The overpass there on the top and the underpass at Belmont. So underpasses also, though, typically have less impact to properties and access because you don't need that much clearance to get underneath the railroad bridge for the vehicular traffic. It's usually around 14 feet for clearance. You've seen the clearance signs above bridges a lot of times, 14, 6, 15 foot. So there's not as much grade differential you need to get underneath that to get that clearance. Unfortunately, or just a matter of fact, is that when you have the overpass options, the overpass clearance requirements of our railroad tracks can be up to 25 feet. So 25 even to 30 feet. So you really have to get that road up and over to allow for the appropriate clearance for the railroad or for the trains. So that's where you'll start to see this. I'm just laying this out so you can keep it in mind as we look at some of these pictures coming up. And again, we're working with the railroad. I'm not sure how many of you have had interaction with railroad and trying to work with them, but they have long lead times on coordination. So it's something to keep in mind if this is something you want to continue to pursue. Starting that coordination and that coalition building with the railroads, letting them know this is something that's being considered is a really good idea. So putting that all together here. Looking at the roadway sections, I mentioned it briefly in the traffic traffic profile. At Villa and Ardmore, again, it's a 2-lane roadway. I know many of you know this. At Addison, it's a 4-lane cross-section. In the motorized alternatives, there will always be accommodation for bicycles and pedestrians for non-motorized travel along with that motorized crossing. So we'd always have some sort of a side path to allow for all modes to use that crossing. When we get into the pedestrian only, I don't have an image up here, but we used a 10-foot walk path, which is pretty substantial. A typical sidewalk to be ADA compliant, Americans with Disabilities Act compliant, would be about 5 feet. So we're doubling the size of that just to provide, number one, a little bit more, being a little bit more conservative on any kind of impact that we would have with those underpasses or overpasses in the pedestrian. But again, something that we can start to refine as we move forward into the next phase. So as we talk about motorized, again, these are the sections we're looking at. So we're going to start looking at the impacts and the benefits. On this next slide, again, motorized only here, again, with the accommodation of pen and bike. But I'm specifically talking about the grade separations for motorized vehicles. I'm showing you this legend just to recognize, and the legend's on each of the next slides, but I want to point out, impacted parcels does not mean that it's a property take. It could just mean that we might need a little bit of right-of-way to put in a retaining wall. It might be an impact to the access. We may not touch the property at all, but once we block the access, now it's an impacted property. So when you see some red shaded parcels, it seems bold, but it's just a comparison between the underpass and overpass options at each of these crossings. So with that lead up, here's what you'll see. So on the left side, so this is at Addison Road, again, motorized crossing. On the left side is the overpass, and again, I talked about that clearance we have to get over the railroad tracks, and so you can see where the roadway needs to take off to gain that elevation to get up and over the tracks. And again, the red is just an impacted property, not a take, or acquiring necessarily. The blue dots are the access or driveway impact, and then the larger green dots reflect where we are impacting a road crossing, where we would have to cul-de-sac or something like that in order to allow this alternative to be put in place. Again, this is a very high-level graphic. You know, it's just more to get a sense of what we were talking about here. On the right side, you'll see the comparison against the underpass at the same location. Again, with gaining the clearance required for motorized vehicles under the railroad tracks, it's a much shorter takeoff point for that roadway to start dipping down to gain that clearance. Okay? So that's Addison. I'm going to flip through these. If you have questions, and I didn't mention this, but if you have questions all along the way, feel free to chime in. I will not be, we can continue on. I'm not going to get distracted. Go ahead. Yeah.
I know you talked about the impacted driveways. What ends up happening? Like, do they have to have shorter driveways because they have like a frontage road? Because for the overpass, I'm assuming that's going to be a bridge that's going to start from back there.
Correct.
So they would, the houses closer to the railroad on the bottom left here, they'd see a big wall, right? Okay.
Right, and so there's a few, and again, we didn't go through all the iterations as part of this process, but yes, you're exactly correct. We would have to find alternative access for those properties to maintain that access, or like you'd mentioned, it might be, you know, a right-of-way take. You know, you'd be, and again, this would be working with the homeowners, the property owners, to determine whether or not they even want to be there once that happens.
Right.
So just a lot of those considerations would come about. But yes, there have to be some sort of a access improvement or access alternative provided. Any other questions while we're here? No? Okay. All right, then we'll move over to Ardmore. And at Ardmore, again, on the left side, you'll see the overpass, and on the right side, you'll see the underpass. Here, there isn't as much existing elevation difference between where the roadway and the railroad are, so you've got a little bit less impact. It's not as far of a elevation to take off or go under the railroad tracks. So a little bit less impact overall. But still, you can see several access locations are impacted. I'm going to keep my hands behind my back. Less driveways are impacted. At Ardmore, because there is Terrace Avenue on the north side, we did do a separate evaluation just to take a peek at that. Again, here you'll see on the left is the underpass, same as what we saw on the right side on the previous graphic. But here you can see if we kept the, and I apologize, the formatting here has not translated well, but it does say the terrace connection. And so we provided an additional structure for terrace on the north side of the tracks, allowing that access to be maintained. So that structure, or where you're able to come back up underneath the overpass, is pushed a little bit further north, so you see a little bit more impact to the properties on the far north there. But it would be an option that might maintain some access for the proposed development in the northeast quadrant there. Just something that was brought up during our stakeholder meeting, so we kind of investigated at least for impact. And then moving to Villa here, currently Villa has a pretty decent elevation difference already. The roadway already rises to meet the crossing location, the railroad tracks there. There's already a bit of a retaining wall. So in order to provide the overpass on the left, you really have to come up from that elevation gain really comes back pretty far. So it's a pretty intense, relatively intense impact to Villa Park properties, both north and south. And then on the east side, you'll see that there's the underpass option as well. Again, much less impact, but again, we're closing that access on Beach that does provide access to many of those single-family properties there on the southwest quadrant. So, are any questions on the motorized before I move on to the non-motorized?
There's only one way to get to Beach right now? Is that correct? No, right? It's not a dead end?
Correct.
It's a dead end?
Each is a dead end.
Yeah, okay.
Again, that's something that could be, reviewed at another point, just to figure out maybe you can connect it somehow through to the next South Street to provide that access there. All right, then we're going to move into the non-motorized alternatives. A little bit different legend here. Same with the impacted parcels, same comment. It could just be that there's a bit of a take. So this is kind of where, on the picture showing here is really, I'm calling these switchback ramps, where you really gain the elevation by kind of switchbacking. Instead of having one long ramp, you just switch back it. You can also provide stairs. For the examples you'll see here, we're using the switchback example to really show the impact to any of the parcels. Again, very high level, and just to give us a sense of what the impacts would be. We can tweak that. There could be a stairway and an elevator. That's a consideration that could move forward instead of having these ramps. When you see some of these impacts, you'll understand. So if we look at Addison, so we did look at an overpass and underpass. Again, this is for non-motorized ped bike crossings. You can see on the left side is the overpass, and each kind of in between the gray spot in between the blue lines is that switchback ramp. So it's like 5 switchbacks to get up and over the railroad tracks. Again, even though it's a pedestrian and bike-only crossing location, you still have to gain that access or the elevation clearance distance over the railroad. So again, you're still going up quite a way to get that access, and it may not be as attractive as using an at-grade crossing for pedestrians and bikes. On the east side, or on the right side here, you'll see that we provided the underpass. Similarly, much less switchback ramp to gain the elevation. Again, now we only have to accommodate a pedestrian or bike minimum clearance, so it's much lower even than what we need for a vehicle, motorized vehicle. So these are just general impacts associated, again, with those non-motorized crossings at Addison. This graphic shows the impacts of the property at Villa Park Metro Station. Again, we didn't look at Ardmore. We felt more utility would be served here if we were to put it right at the Metro Station. Again, addressing a lot of the public comment that we got back on the public survey back in April and May. On the top is the overpass, and again, those switchback ramps, pretty long. On the bottom, you'll see the underpass. Again, a little bit less impact or a little less infrastructure required to get that underpass under the railroad tracks. And here, there's no property takes, there's no real impact. We do impact a few parking spaces, and again, with more refinement in the alternatives development process in the next phase, you could get this to maybe even be very negligible as far as impact. As part of this, you'll see on the right side of the graphics, both underpass and overpass, something that would make this more attractive for funding options, for railroad approvals, is to eliminate the at-grade crossing currently there for the pedestrians by providing that underpass. So it's kind of a, hey, if we close this, it would improve your, it would eliminate an at-grade crossing. They may look more fondly upon that and help maybe be a little more supportive of this effort. So just something to keep in mind. When we look at Villa, again, this is not motorized, overpass on the left, underpass on the right. Again, that existing elevation difference between the tracks and where the road could start, or where the road is to get to an underpass or an overpass for the pedestrians. For the underpass or overpass in particular, a lot of switchback ramp to get underneath the railroad tracks. On the right side, you'll see an underpass, and with this layout, we're actually able to use the elevation difference to our advantage here, because you can start taking advantage. Instead of having the sidewalk coming up with the roadway, you could actually have it start going down, kind of maintaining where that underpass would go straight underneath the railroad tracks, and then the opposite side, we would have to gain that elevation back with some switchback ramps. That's where you're seeing the impact of the properties. Any questions on these? Bless you.
Excuse me.
So for all of this, we started to base our evaluation criteria not only on just some of the things that we looked at for the existing conditions, like the environment, the traffic, some of the crash data, but we also took into consideration what we heard from the survey, and also what we had heard with the stakeholder meeting with the Villa Park internal stakeholders. So we did look at, we looked at business impacts, we looked at some of the parking, on-street parking impacts in particular. Utility impacts are an issue, makes the project a bit more expensive when you start getting into having to relocate utilities. Obviously, cost is a big factor here, more for just the planning and trying to understand where funding opportunities may lie. And then also even potential railroad acceptance. So just all kinds of things that we considered. We kind of summarized it in, I'll walk through just kind of the bullet list. In the end, we kind of put it to a color-coded where these things lie, a little bit easier to digest, but I'll run through these. You know, we talked about it a little bit with Addison. This had the highest daily traffic volume, so you'd be accommodating more traffic through if we were to grade separate that location. Also has the highest recorded delay. It looks good on grant applications to show that it's got that delay, but to be honest, we have a lot of grade crossings in the Chicagoland area, and our delay is a lot higher than a lot across the nation. So all of these are very high delay relatively, competing for dollars that are at the Federal Railroad Administration level. This opportunity would provide, or grade separation here would provide maybe better access to the schools and public open space there. Again, that's like on the reverse side. If we impact the property, we'd have to do some mitigation. But also maybe improves the opportunity for community connection and even active transportation, maybe allowing the opportunity for more people not to have to be stuck by trains and be able to use bikes and walk to school or walk to the community center. Considerations here, there is a lack of connectivity on Addison. It doesn't go, Ardmore and Villa both go all the way to the north at North Avenue and all the way to the south at Roosevelt. Addison here has that jog right at St. Charles, so it doesn't have continuous access all the way through Villa Park, so that's a consideration. It's also one of the most expensive grade separation options just because it is that 4-lane section. Either way, if you go over or under, it's just a larger cross-section that you need to accommodate for infrastructure. This also has a large impact to residential access, more parcels in particular than, say, the Ardmore option. And there may be impact to the church property. Again, just something to be considering. We look at Ardmore, there is that connectivity from North Avenue to Roosevelt on the south. It's more centrally located in Villa Park. There's an existing grade separation to the north here as well, which allows a little bit more reliability for EMS. While that north crossing may not be blocked as much as we're experiencing here on the UP line, it still shows a positive benefit for emergency response times when you start just providing that story to funding givers. And then obviously the proximity to the metro station may be a benefit here. Again, with the issues of trains on either side, even being confused as to which side you're supposed to board on, maybe having that underpass, motorized underpass there would benefit, maybe even bring some economic development. I talked about the emergency response, and then this also has the lowest parcel impact of any options, both the overpass and the underpass. There are some multifamily properties on the south side that while it's only a one parcel, there might be more impact to residents. So again, something to consider, kind of a balancing. Maybe there also might be some planned impacts to the development that's already planned for the Ecoterra on the northeast corner. Moving to Villa, again, we have the connectivity. There's a great opportunity here to improve the connection for the Salt Creek Trail. There's less benefit overall here, just due when we look at how the metro station is used and maybe even how Addison would be used with the access to the public space on the north side of the tracks. We did not take counts for the use of Salt Creek. That would be something that should be considered in the next phase to really understand that impact. But overall, just what we've been seeing with the criteria we looked at, this provided the least benefit of the consideration, or of the alternatives. There's also high residential impact here for over and under. Again, that grade elevation difference between the roadway and the current railroad, it takes a lot of effort to get up and over for an overpass. Here we also had the lowest daily traffic. And this also is pretty close to the Illinois 83, already grade separated, so if you're looking for the benefit for emergency response, it may not have that much of an impact based on having the opportunity to take Illinois 83. And there were several more utility impacts at this location. So, to show it in color, you can see on the west side, on the left side is Addison, and some of the criteria we looked at, again, the parcel impacts, utilities, that existing grade separation to the north of the UP tracks, and then we even included some of the construction costs, high-level construction cost. Addison and Ardmore, we had 3 options there because we allowed for that underpass at Terrace connection, so that shows a little bit more impact as far as cost. And then we have Villa Avenue. So here you can see, you're just comparing the numbers of red boxes. Addison as an underpass looks maybe not terrible. Ardmore has more green boxes for their options. Just kind of a balance between how the village really wants to pursue, what's most important to the village. And then Villa, you can see some more red boxes, but some of the things, including, the cost there, again, is a little bit lower than maybe some of the Ardmore options. So I'll leave that up for a second more. Any questions on this? All right, non-motorized. We're getting there, guys. We're getting there. All right, so the non-motorized alternative summary here, we're talking about Addison Road. There is some benefit here if we provide a pedestrian and bike-only crossing, a grade separation here. Could provide better access to the schools and public open space, and again, that opportunity for more active transportation and connecting the community. Some considerations here. At Addison, the Metro blockages, so the 60 trains per day that are Metro, may not block this location as frequently as we see at Ardmore. So that may be just a consideration, not as high of a utility with this location of an underpass. There are more property impacts due to that multifamily housing south of the crossing. And then there is a railroad signal you can see here in the image on that mast, overhead signal mast, that it's probably going to be an issue. I don't think the railroad would look fondly on that if we need to move that or if we impact it. So just a consideration again at Addison. And based on the length of those ramps to get over, at least what we're showing right now in the concept, users may still continue to use that grade crossing. So if you put the investment in there for an underpass or overpass and it's not being used, kind of defeats the purpose. So just again, some consideration. Now when we look at Villa Park, there's a lot of benefit here. We talked about the riders being able to cross to one side or the other, depending on where the trains are. You've got the improved reliability, might attract more users to the station, might improve some economic development there, and then eliminates, at least for the pedestrian and the bike only, issues with metro blockages there. And considerations here, there may be some impact to the platforms based on trying to provide that overpass or underpass. So again, you're going to have to be coordinating with the Union Pacific Railroad anyway, but just again, something more to talk with them about. And then Villa Avenue, again, we talked about the benefits. This would be, again, the pedestrian on bike only. Would improve the Greenway Trail connection. I know there's an ongoing study currently that's recommending the west side of the street to improve that. So there still would have to be some crossing of Villa Avenue for those trail users, even if we provided this underpass or overpass here. And again, potentially fewer users, something we would need to verify in the next phase of the project, just as far as counts of pedestrians and bikes. And then we did the same thing here. We kind of summarized it with, greater than, less than, green, red, yellow. And again, we're seeing more benefit or maybe more positive impact at the metro station crossing for a pedestrian or bike only. And again, estimated costs in there. Any questions here? Okay, easy bunch here. All right, so wait, before I do that, you ready for our initial recommendations? If you couldn't tell by my tone of voice while I describe these locations, based on just what we've seen for really the utility and the benefit for motorized crossings, again, I think you get the best bang for the buck at Addison or at Ardmore. I don't know that there's enough there yet to really determine. I think the next phase, which you would go into next, would be like the phase 1 or the NEPA process, and that's really where those two alternatives would be explored in more detail. I know some of the concerns that we'd mentioned before were induced demand. I think that came up at the previous meeting of the whole. If we do provide a grade separation at one of the crossings, would that draw more traffic to that street to use the grade separation? And that's something that would have to be explored. There'd have to be some projections, comparing it to other improvement projects in the region to see how that kind of induced demand or that change in travel pattern would happen. But something to consider, and maybe that would be the deciding factor for Addison or Ardmore. All of these options would improve safety, and that would be recognized by Illinois Commerce Commission, ICC. The railroad would appreciate, some of these improvements as well, just eliminating some of their at-grade crossings. But again, the two that we're seeing, at least that are rising to the top in the feasibility study, Addison and Ardmore for motorized. The non-motorized, definitely, well, I won't say definitely. Initial recommendations would be to have the grade separation for pedestrian only at Villa Park Metro Station. Just seems that it makes the most sense. That's what we heard from the community survey. It really was pretty meaningful to have that location be grade separated, if only pedestrian bike. And then, speaking of the underpass options do provide less impact overall. So regardless of motorized or non-motorized, the underpass does seem to be better options as far as any kind of mitigation that you'd have to do for impacts. The railroad will need some convincing. They prefer overpasses, obviously. They don't have to deal with the structure, but that's something that can't be overcome. And Steve Pazinski has some work here. Steve, who's with us with CDM Smith, he's doing some similar projects in Glen Ellen and Elmhurst, and they have successfully gotten approval for some pedestrian underpasses at those metro stations. So just something to consider, and if that spurs some questions, we can talk about that in a minute. But then also a staged implementation. So seeing those graphics, seeing those images where you see all the impact and it's like, wow, that's a lot. It doesn't have to happen all at once. This whole process really will take time, regardless of its overpass or underpass. But you could also go into this phase one, recognizing the NEPA requirements, any kind of mitigation that would be required, explore all these options in that document, and then from that document, recommendations really could come out being a staged implementation. You could have a nearer term, say pedestrian bike only, grade separation, and then in the future, recognizing what types of funding opportunities, when those funding opportunities are scheduled, you could start a plan to do something bigger and longer term. So from that next phase, you really could start staging the implementation. And then we talked about the coalition building, starting to talk with the railroad, starting to talk with ICC, starting to talk with your representatives to let them know that this is something that the community really does feel strongly about, that you're exploring both non-motorized and motorized options, just getting that whole process started, working with utilities, everybody that's going to be a stakeholder in that process, just starting those conversations. And I know, Mike, you've talked about just kind of starting conversations just to see how things are going. Nothing formal, but how would it play out? What's the temperature of those other agencies and other stakeholders? So as it stands, these are our initial recommendations. I think it's a really great project. The Metro Station underpass seems like a great idea to me. So with that, we can bring it to an open discussion.
A couple questions on the, if we do it at the Metro Station. If we do a motorized underpass, would that take the place of the pedestrian underpass then? Or would you build both of them?
It wouldn't necessarily have to. And again, that might be the phased implementation. If there was going to be a motorized crossing in the future, yes, it would accommodate all modes. But if you were to do a pedestrian only first, it would still be a Metro Station underpass or overpass, depending. I mean, in the future, looking at the alternatives, that might be a better option. You might be able to do an elevator, up and over versus putting in a overpass.
You mentioned Elmhurst. I know that they've been talking about that for a while. Is that going to be where the existing pedestrian underpass is, or is it going to be a separate one?
I'm going to turn that to Steve.
It's, so originally they were looking at actually having 2 underpasses there, but that underpass is
come to the-
Could you come to the microphone? And state your name real quick, please.
Am I on? Yeah. Great. My name is Steve Pazinski, CDM Smith, and to answer your question about Elmhurst, there is an existing underpass there. It's in pretty poor condition. The thought was to retrofit it, but it's in such a condition that they're going to build on new location. So it'll be similar style. It'll be ADA accessible with the stairs option, and yeah.
Has that been pretty well received by Metro or by UP there?
Yeah, we actually have approval on that one, and the one in Glen Ellen was just rejected. So, but to no fear, this is standard protocol. There's a lot of, the UP Railroad is very siloed, so that was our engineering in Omaha that rejected that, but we just met with Public Affairs, and they're completely on board. If by chance those two get together and decide to go against it, we would file a petition. It's in our schedule with the ICC, and it is not a lock, but that is a very predictable process, and we don't see any in either location. And I think that ultimately would be very similar for, you just have to ensure, they're so concerned about their operations and about deflection. So those are the two things you just got to make sure you can handle, so.
Okay, thanks.
Well,
Anyone else, any other comments? Questions?
I just have like a general question. So the average delay, you said it's higher than most places that you've seen?
So if you look in Chicago, I'll say Ardmore, that has the highest, or Addison rather, that has the highest grade delay, is actually ranked 60th within like the CMAP region, because I think the highest was like 900 hours of delay. However, when you look across the country, not all of those grade separate or at-grade railroad crossings are being considered right now for a grade separation. So when you show this kind of delay associated with your crossings, that's something that would catch the eye of people reviewing applications from around the country. You know, there's very few regions that have as many crossings. In fact, I think we might have the most at-grade railroad crossings of anywhere. No, we're in the top 3 for sure. So it's just one of those things where you can use that to your advantage.
And then just for me, is that like average daily drivers divided by average delay of the passing?
Yeah, so
Okay.
so there is some, Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning, CMAP, had put out a study in 2018 that did, recognize how much traffic was there, recognize how many lanes was there, and then looked at the types of trains crossing by, looking at the average blockage. So like a metro train is maybe 2 to 3 minutes of a block. Some of these larger freight trains can be 10 minutes, of wait time, blockage. And so they did that math to say, okay, if you have this much traffic on an average day, and there's this much delay based on 100 trains and the type of train, yeah, they kind of divided it by that just to get that average hour.
How often do they update CMAP? Because between 2018 and now, I'm sure the train traffic has increased quite a bit.
And that's something that maybe CMAP wouldn't update frequently. Again, the last time they did, it was 2018. But that's something in that phase 1 that could be investigated further and really get the actual count as of today and get that existing data to make that calculation. And again, to create a better case for your project.
Looking at your preliminary data, it seems like you're kind of looking more at Ardmore. That would be a better spot.
It seems that it is based on many of the things we looked at, including cost. It's a little bit lower cost than Addison. Addison has more lanes of traffic, but it'd be more expensive. There's less impact to parcels at Ardmore, so it'd be less coordination with, landowners, while the properties might be larger at Ardmore, so there might be some other considerations that have to be taken into account. It just seems that Ardmore is rising to the top. Again, when you start looking at maybe the induced delay, or if there's, I know that I have a couple more slides right after this, but the comp plan, the Villa Park comprehensive plan is being updated right now. So there may be some reason or some planning process that recognizes certain properties that they don't want to have impacted. And if that were the case, that might sway the choice maybe to Addison. So a lot to consider. But from what we've seen so far, in fact, that Lust site that we saw is actually on the EcoTerra property.
Right.
So if we do it right, we won't touch it.
Sure.
Which was really like the one environmental flag that we kind of saw that we might have to mitigate. The other being environmental justice. That's the only thing that we did see. We didn't get the full data, but it's potential with some multifamily housing, not really understanding the mix of income levels on those properties. So if that were something, again, there's mitigation for that as well. That could be accommodated through the NEPA process to recognize what kind of mitigation strategies would work for the village.
Okay, thank you. Trustee Corkery, you?
So what would the next steps for the board look like for this stuff?
Oh, thank you for asking. I'll just walk through these next steps, and then this last slide, it kind of lays out maybe how to successfulally implement or continue this momentum, to be honest. Starting this, showing the interest, showing the commitment that the village has, and really recognizing, you could go through the NEPA process and have I'll stop there, and then we'll say, for our next steps, from what we've heard here today, we'll document any comments. Obviously, there'll be some time that you can turn around some questions if you want to send them to Mike or send them to the team. We'll finalize the alternatives based on any of those comments. If there's something you want us to look at, maybe a little bit of refinement, we can do that. Or maybe just address some of the questions. Maybe something comes up later. We talked about the access. Is that a take if you take their access? We'll, develop our final recommendations, and then we'll identify the next phase for the potential improvements. And at this stage, really, to do successful implementation, we mentioned the comprehensive plan. We'd provide input there. So that's something that our team would continue to do. Again, economic development possibilities, showing this demonstrated commitment and a funding plan. That's probably really the next step. It doesn't necessarily have to be the NEPA process, but really recognizing, okay, what funding opportunities exist for the type of improvement you're looking at? What time or what schedule do those opportunities fall? They have calls for projects to help, recognize what funding or what projects have the highest potential to win those grant opportunities. So that would probably be something to help you, some of those prices we saw are a little steep, $30 million is a lot of dough. But then there's also still, even before that, we have the NEPA process, which runs, there's some cost involved there. You have a design phase that's usually about 8 to 15% of the construction. So you've got a lot of these costs to go along. So recognizing the funding plan and recognizing if it's something that there is potential to pursue, really going into the next phase would show that commitment and have the ICC, have UP start paying attention. They're going to recognize that the board is really behind it and really does want to understand the best alternative for the village. So just again, keeping that momentum, what we've talked about with Mike a bit is, the conversation has happened a lot, but there hadn't been this data-driven focus of what type of solution would work. Starting to document all of that, particularly in a document like a National Environmental Protection Act document. It could be even just a categorical exclusion. There might not be that much impact based on how we refine the alternatives, so that this could get it could be eligible for federal funding. It would show that your commitment is, to protect the environment and to encourage any kind of mitigation strategies that would be required. And then that really does show that you mean it and that the money, it allows you to be eligible for that funding.
Would it be a good idea to begin looking for funding now with like senator, their state, our federal senator and reps do that now?
Yes. And I think that's where that coalition building comes into. Just getting more, demonstrating that there is support for it, recognizing that the community wants it, that there is this push. And again, seeing the data and recognizing the types of impacts, even though everyone's talked about possibly having a grade separation, it sounds like a great idea. When you start seeing what it really means, maybe people will say, Illinois 83 isn't too bad. I'll cut around that way. But again, until you really see it in these impacts, you won't know.
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just to build off that, this feasibility study was really to see the actual impacts and like Mrs. Curl said, kind of quantifying them and to help build that correlation. If we go after funding, we now have kind of a unified voice that this is our plan, this is our procedure, and this is why we're choosing this location. There is still refinement that needs to be done. That's what the next phase is refining it. And when you're starting into the grants, we kind of looked at the 30,000-foot view here, but refining it to kind of get some quantifiable data. But yes, to go after and start talking, we can create white pages off of this that creates talking points to our elected officials when we go after funding, and then that helps build that correlation. They now have the facts. They now know why we are choosing this location and what we want and what we need, and we do have quantifiable data. We did look at it. We did seek some public input and help build that story, because really that's what it comes down to when funding is you got to have a story, and you have to be well defined in what your story is and why you're seeking that funding.
I have a question. What does a timeline look like? I don't think we talked about that.
You're in luck. So I did hide some slides. I'm just going to go out because in the initial meeting, we walked through kind of the phasing, and this was, the feasibility phase. So let me just exit real quick. I hope this doesn't get us too far out, but I'm just going to unhide these slides. Oh, hopefully they can hear. Don't read it all by yourself. Let's go through it in the full on.
And then as you're doing that, does emergency service response time get factored into this, and then how does that get factored?
Yep. So so I worked on the I-290 environmental impact statement, the EIS, for a while, for about 10 years, and part of that was how by changing ramp access points, how does that improve your emergency response time? So it really is more the calculation of how much further out of direction travel there is, how much does the improvement actually help. Like in this situation, you would show both your fire stations are right close to Ardmore. Having that opportunity just to have it grade separated, not having to go all the way around. And to know that it will always be, it will never be blocked because the grade separation is there is important. So it does show, that's another factor that would get you some some perks in looking for funding to show that kind of response time improvement. And obviously coordination with EMS as well. So we were in the feasibility stage. It was an 8 to 9 month process. The cost of this phase was just under $100,000. We did all the things we said we would, and now we'll be moving on, if you choose to, move on to the phase 1, and let me see if I hit the button again. No. So phase 1 here, which is, again, is the NEPA process. Yeah, and the formatting just somehow didn't carry over here, but timeline here is 18 to 24 months. You get the environmental clearance. Again, that would allow for opportunities for funding. Again, here's where you do a lot of that coalition building with your railroad agencies, or the railroad, your agencies, utility coordinations, other stakeholders, public involvement, additional public involvement. You'd look more at the geometric, really, again, the refinement of the alternatives. You're going to really be looking at what the impact is, getting it down to understanding, do you want to do an elevator versus just the ramps? Those kind of details would get figured out here. And then you'd have your purpose and need statement, and then you start to look at your, securing the funding. Now that you'd have this document, if it be, once it's approved, then it opens up those opportunities for you to really make your case. So here we're estimating, the cost of this type of phase. Again, it's a little bit pricier than feasibility because there's a lot more detail that's provided. It really gets you to almost 30% design plans, which is pretty significant as far as from where we are now to there, to allow to see what the true impact really would be. So that's phase 1, and then we have phase 2, which is the design. Again, this could be a 2-month process. This is really where the coordination comes down, behind the scenes. Hopefully the railroads, you've been talking with the railroads and the utilities to understand the impact and what is required of them. And again, this is we have the cost of the phase. I'd mentioned between the 8 and 15% of a construction cost, so depending on if it's overpass, underpass, it's kind of around that, $2 to $3 million range for the design. And then, it would go up from there if you have to acquire right-of-way, taking parcels, a few other considerations that could increase the overall tag, not necessarily for the phase 2, but just the cost borne by the village. Then we go into construction as the 3rd phase. And this timeline is probably pretty aggressive, depending on what type of alternative you'd go with. This could be maybe 2 to 3 years for construction. And again, we have cost of this phase as 20 to 25 million. You saw some of those. This was originally what we'd shown back in April, doing a little more investigation and looking at some projects regionally where they fell as far as the cost for over an underpass. Those estimates are probably more in line. So anywhere between 7 to 20 million for a pedestrian only, ped bike only, and then 20 to 60 for motorized. No extra zeros, just higher.
It seems a pretty aggressive timeline, because from what I've seen, it's usually you're looking upwards of 10 years from start to finish.
Yeah.
So
So this is, and assuming that you could get some of this coalition building, each of these phases we've kind of said around 2 years, so that's putting you at 6.
Yeah.
10 probably wouldn't be too far off.
Might as well go for it.
It's like planting a tree, right? You don't plant it for the shade for yourself.
Right.
You plant it for the use of benefit of others.
There you go. Thank you. Okay, any other questions or comments? Okay, so we'll wait for the final report from you,
Yeah.
and then we'll go from there.
Mike, then you can coordinate.
Yes, I guess that's the last bit, is if there's any comments or questions, feel free to pass them along to me, and we'll work with Jesse and our team. I think part of that is we're going into the budget cycle here pretty soon, so I think that's some of the direction we're looking at. Is this something we wish to continue? And then at which pace? Do we want pedestrian? And then lastly, I think the initial recommendations is Addison or Ardmore. Obviously, you can see that there's really no great definable location. They both have their benefits and their cons. If one of those are kind of preferable to the board or to the trustees, that would be helpful information. Obviously, this is a feasibility study, so we want it to be a productive study. We want it to be a useful study, and that takes some input too as well. Last thing we want to do is get recommendations and not be something that the board wishes, that recommendation. They would like to see it somewhere else. So we want to make it useful.
The phase 2 was like 600, 800,000. Is that spread over like a year and a half or 2 years? That would probably be over 2 budget years?
Correct.
Yeah, okay.
And part of it comes down to is if we do the implemented phasing, we'd probably look at, do we do the NEPA for like the entire site, like say we do Ardmore? We may want to look at doing the NEPA for both motorized and non-motorized, just to get that whole corridor done. We do have to look at some timing, because I do know like some of the environmentals, they do have expiration dates now, those sort of things. So some of those numbers may be adjustable depending on if we just want to go only pedestrian or if we want to look at the whole site. But that will filter out, I think, if there's any comments from the board. I think those are some of the comments we're looking at, if that's the appetite, or is the appetite maybe just to look at pedestrian, and then if we move forward, then we can kind of fine tune a lot of those numbers for consideration.
Anything else from the board? Well, thank you.
Okay.
Appreciate,
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Appreciate your time. But looks good. Okay, we'll open this up for public comments. Any public comments?
Yes, Joe Amori wanted to speak.
Do I need to sign?
No, I get you,
Maury,
Joe.
309 East Maple. I chair the Bike, Pedestrian, and Transit Subcommittee. And we created a work product back in 2019, specifically looking at how this would affect our subcommittee, the Bike, Pedestrian, and Transit. However, we did take into account the disruption to neighborhoods and the cost being cost prohibitive if you made it for vehicles too. And we passed that along to the new manager in 2020. And we like to think that this is the fruit of that seed that was planted there. We appreciate the work that everything has been done to expand on our work. We would like, I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to keep most of them for the next stakeholder meeting, because I think it would be, we'd all be better served if we brought the Traffic and Safety Commission into this conversation, because we all bring our unique experiences into the, to help make Villa Park a better place. For example, my 39 and a half years on the railroad wasn't just taking tickets on Metro trains. I worked as a flagman on construction projects and kept freight trains away from contractors that were working near the track. So I know, the bad involvement that could happen if you don't answer things or address things appropriately. I have one question or two that I'd like to get out there. First of all, we already have a cooperation agreement with Elmhurst on the Villa Avenue Improvement Project. Would they also be brought into the conversation? Should we choose Villa as either motorized or non-motorized?
Cool.
To answer your question, Joe, yes, they would have to be involved. At Villa, there is the jurisdiction is down the middle. So when we get into the next phase, we would have to incorporate Elmhurst into the conversations at that location on Villa.
Okay, and this program may no longer be available, but at one time there was money paid out to communities for closing railroad crossings. So if you decide to put in the pedestrian underpass at the station and close that east crosswalk, there might be some money coming back to you from that. And I know that Metro, actually Union Pacific, the property owner of the station, that would make that property much more attractive if that pedestrian underpass was there. So that's one thing they also should take into consider. The other thing I wanted to ask was I'd sent out an email today about a vendor who looks at current data, and one of the reasons I brought that to your attention is because that vendor is currently working with the city of Barrington to determine the trains affecting their rail crossings. Barrington is served by the Union Pacific Metro Northwest Line passenger service and the Canadian National Freight Service, which mirrors what we deal with here. So they might be, somebody might add some value to the conversation, because the 2018 data doesn't take into account the super long trains, these so-called non-fitters. And we've just gotten information that now that this Canadian Pacific and Kansas City Southern has been finalized, Union Pacific is working out an agreement with Canadian National and another railroad that might increase our freight trains even more. On the photograph, A couple of things I wanted to point out in the photographs. On your page 16 slide, it showed Villa Avenue along with Ardmore as having sidewalks on each side. At Villa Avenue, there's only one sidewalk, not two. And also, I was wondering why there wasn't considered at the Metro Station that they didn't try to put the underpass farther down at the east end where the elevation is higher, where it would be more of a straight-through bore than having to go back and forth to get down into a certain level. And the other question I wanted to find out was that when you consider an underpass, are you also considering the pumping infrastructure that would need to keep the water out of there? When Metro redid the stations at Berkeley and Bellwood, they actually put underpasses to get from the station, from the parking lot over to the far platforms. And the first heavy rain they had, both those stations flooded out, and trains were bypassing them for about 2 weeks until they could.
30 seconds.
Yeah, thank you. So is the pump house infrastructure taken into account when you consider an underpass?
Either one. So to answer a couple of your questions, this is all kind of concepts, Joe. So like the location of like the actual crossing, say at the Metro, would be finalized in the phase 1 alignment. The impacts to utilities is very generic, but yeah, stormwater was at a very high level would be consideration, knowing that if you go to an underpass, we would have to look at some pumping stations. I believe CDM Smith kind of incorporated that in their high budget values. Additionally, we looked at like the existing utilities. Like Villa, we have 6 sewers, I think, underneath that road at that section. So if we go under, we have to relocate a lot of our sanitary and storm sewers there. What are those impacts? It's a very high level, but yes, those considerations when they talked about utility impacts were considered in their recommendations and I believe their programming funding that they budgeted in this.
Okay. And like I said, the slide that was on page 33, it only showed Metro train blocking. It didn't show any Union Pacific freight blockages. But finally, I'd like to say we're welcoming the opportunity to go to the next stakeholders meeting. We would like you to bring in traffic and safety. I've got a number of other questions. I'm sure they all want to bring something to the conversation. So thank you for all your hard work.
Okay, thanks, Joe. Okay, anyone else? Public comments? Okay, seeing none, we have a motion to adjourn. Trustee Cordova, do you have a second? Second. Trustee Kozar. Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, any opposed? Okay, we will close the committee of the whole meeting at 7:02, and we will reconvene our normal meeting at, give everybody a few minutes, 7:10. So we'll be back at 7:10. Thank you.